Hello and welcome to version 1.0 of Pride at NU's Asynchronous Safe Zone training. As you might guess from version 1.0, this is our first version of an asynchronous safe zone training. So we're really going to look forward to any feedback you might have. You can contact us. Our website is on the slide here, pridenu.wixsite.com/pride. You can contact us there if you have any feedback. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, this training is based on the excellent free materials provided by the Safe Zone Project. You can see their website is on the slide itself, the safezoneproject.com. I highly encourage you to visit that website. They've got excellent materials. They're always updating them. You can see this is their 5th edition of the training, so it has really grown and developed. And there's all sorts of supplementary activities, tips on facilitation, everything you need. It's all free. It's all open source, and it's all materials that you are encouraged to use as you wish. So you don't need to ask permission to use those materials. You don't need to ask permission to edit them or tweak them for your audience. So if you are training, I would strongly encourage you to check out the Safe Zone Project at thesafezoneproject.com and look at what they have, and feel free to customize your training for your audience. So Asynchronous Safe Zone version 1.0. This is going to comprise a asynchronous part, the part you're watching now, where you're going to learn the materials and reflect on your own time, at your own pace, however works for you. Then in a second part, a shorter part than was traditional in the traditional full synchronous in-person or Zoom training, you're going to meet with a trainer, with some other folks, and you're going to reflect on this information. You're going to reflect on the thinking you did. And that's a really vital part of this training. So both parts are really important, that you get the materials and the information and do the reflection now during part 1, and then also the part 2 where you connect with other people. You really need both of them. So part 2 is going to have its own norms and expectations. Those are going to be very different because, of course, you're dealing with other people. Folks may disclose sensitive things. You're on the clock. So that's going to have its own set of norms, but group norms are really important even for this one-on-one self-paced bit. So here are the 3 group norms that we'd like you to keep in mind as you go through this training. So first, bring the same energy, respect, focus, and open mind that you would to an in-person training. We totally get it. It's really easy when you're doing something on your own at home, maybe on a break at work, whenever it might be. It's easy to get distracted, especially if it's something where you're supposed to spend 10 minutes reflecting, to spend 2 minutes when 10 minutes is suggested, or to race through. So if you rush through a reflection, if you rush through an activity, that's only gonna mean that you're not gonna get what you need out of that. So to get what you need out of this training, really set aside the time, the energy, and the space that you need to really engage with this preparatory part of the training. It's gonna make the second half rich and interesting. And again, the whole point of this training is for it to have value to you. So don't cheat yourself on that. Norm number 2, questions, questions, questions. This is in the group norms for the synchronous training for the regular safe zone, but it absolutely holds for, again, a self-paced, self-reflection, self-guided portion of a training. So this part of the training is going to give you some basic information about LGBTQ literacy, and it's going to give you a structured opportunity to start reflecting on these concepts, terms, and ideas. So the hope is that you're not just going to take in this information, but that you're going to think about it. And that's going to bring up a lot of questions for you. We really hope so, and it really should. So, jot down lots of notes, however you like to. If you're a paper and pencil person, if you've got an annotation tool you want to use, stickies, voice memos, whatever it is. But we really hope that as you go through this, if you notice something where you say, or maybe you disagree, or you've heard differently, or you had a different experience, that's fantastic. Make a note of that. You're going to bring that to part 2 of the training, and that's going to make that really rich for you. Number 3, the biggest and the most important here is be kind to yourself and be prepared to change your mind. So during part 2, during the synchronous group part, it's really common for people to experience major mind shifts. They always thought that something was a certain way, and then they say, "Gosh, you know what? Actually, maybe I don't think that anymore. Maybe I always thought that LGBT people were like this, but maybe they're different." Um, However, don't underestimate what you might learn and discover in part 1. So be prepared to maybe suddenly see a situation in the past where you thought you were behaving kindly or professionally, and then you read about some best practices and you say, "Oh gosh, maybe I wasn't my best self there." Or something where you thought you understood what a certain word meant, and now you realize, "Oh, maybe you didn't," and you feel a little foolish about that. So again, this is meant to be a learning experience, and for many people, it's a really profound one. So take time to process if you have a big idea or a new idea. Give yourself some grace and some space. It's wonderful to grow and change your mind, even though that may be sometimes a bit painful. And absolutely, if you're really struggling with something that comes up in this training, as always, reach out to a trusted friend, a counselor, or a family member to unpack. Um, and we here at Pride at NU would love to help as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you want to unpack part of what you're going through this training. But you should also have an opportunity in part 2 as well. So be kind. Now, this bit of the training is just an introduction to a basic bit of terminology. When we talk about safe zone training, you're going to hear the acronym LGBTQ many times, and often you'll see a plus to mean more than this. So, the LGBTQ is an acronym. You're going to see it throughout the training, and it refers to diverse sexualities and gender. And you can see that here in this picture of this umbrella, you've got the Q for queer, and that's an umbrella, and it's covering LGB, which are some common sexualities, lesbian, gay, bisexual. And it's also covering T for transgender. So in this way of thinking about this acronym, queer is an overarching umbrella, and then you've got lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and many other identities under that umbrella. Now, not everyone agrees with this umbrella. Personally, I do not. I know plenty of folks who are lesbian or gay or transgender who say, "You know what? No, I'm not queer. Thank you very much," or who see these as very separate things. So you don't need to agree with this formulation. And if you disagree, absolutely make some notes. It'll be a great thing to talk about in the synchronous training. But just be aware that when we talk about LGBTQ, we're using this as a shorthand for all of the different sexualities and genders that are out there. Now, at this point, you may be saying, "Wait, sexualities and genders?" Like, you may already have some questions here, which is great. If you do, take a pause, write down those questions, but just be aware of this acronym because we're going to see it often. Okay, the first activity in this self-paced training is first impressions of LGBTQ people. So this is a self-reflecting exercise. We recommend you spend maybe 10 minutes, but you can absolutely spend as long as you like. You may find that you need a little more time if you've got some deep memories here. So you don't need to answer every single one of these questions, but at least take a try to think about them, kind of go back through your life and see if you can remember anything. You will absolutely not have to share any of this. So please do yourself a favor and don't be worried about having the right answer or coming up with an answer that you feel comfortable sharing in the group. The idea is to get you to sort of think back about your earliest memories around differences with gender and sexuality. So we've got 5 questions here, and the 5 questions are: when is the first time you can remember learning that some people are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer? And then the second question is relating to that, and it's: where did most of the influence of your initial impressions and understanding of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer people come from? So maybe it was family, friends, maybe it was TV, books, maybe it was the news, church, some other influence. So just thinking back, when do you first remember realizing that there are people who are not heterosexual, who are not straight? And, where did you mostly get your first ideas about what that meant? And then questions 3 or 4 are the same question, but this is about people who are transgender. And if you don't even know what transgender means, that's fine. Don't worry about it. We'll get into it in later parts of the training, and you can absolutely come back to this part of the training if you want. So questions 3 or 4 are asking you when you can first remember learning that some people are transgender. And again, where did most of the influence in how you thought about that came from? Was it family, friends, TV, church, books, news, whatever it might be? When did you first realize that was a thing? And what shaped your earliest impressions? Okay, so we're looking back at your earliest memories. And later on in the training, we'll see why we separate out lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. But think about all of those groups of folks. And then in question 5, how has your understanding of folks who are part of this LGBTQ umbrella, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer questioning, how has that changed or evolved? So how did it begin for you? And how has that changed? So again, you don't need to share any of this. And again, the goal is to get you thinking. So if not even writing things down will help you feel more comfortable, that's fine. But the idea is do some reflecting and then make whatever notes you're comfortable making so that you can engage in some reflection around this topic with the group. Again, you don't need to share anything you're not comfortable with, but make some notes. You might be surprised as you get the discussion going, you might feel a little more comfortable than you thought. So you just want to make sure you haven't lost any of those valuable insights or ideas you had when you did this. So again, pause the video, take about 10 minutes. You can do it in bits, however you like, but really spend some time thinking back on this issue. Okay, so you finished reflecting, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. Always really interesting to hear about how folks first became aware of difference around sexuality and gender. And now we're in core vocabulary, which for those of you who are really saying, gosh, I want to get some concrete information out of this training, this is going to be a really great activity for you. So the core vocabulary is 3 pages long, and you can download the complete participant packet, and that's going to have all of the pages. So we'll include a link to that. It's on our Pride at NU website. It's on the Safe Zone project, but we will again make sure we include a link to it. So it is 3 pages long. This is not a complete core vocabulary. And I will also mention, if you are already really familiar with this area and you are looking through this vocabulary and you say, yep, I know all these terms inside and out, if you go to the facilitator version of the training, there's an expanded vocabulary, which is much longer, much more comprehensive. So you can use the core vocabulary for this activity. And for most folks, there's going to be plenty in the core vocabulary to learn. But again, if this is an area you already have a lot of experience with, you may find that you want to jump ahead and look at the larger vocabulary in the facilitator version of this training. So entirely up to you. So, with this, you're going to go over this as a group in part 2, but the idea here is you're just going to go through and make a note of some words that may be new to you. So what we recommend you do is first you go through and just read the boldface words, not the definitions, but just the word itself. And if there's something that you're not sure 100% what it is, put a star next to it. So you can kind of do your own annotation. Sometimes people like to have a check for something that they know the word, but they're kind of thinking, maybe I don't know it 100%. And they want to use a star for something that's like, I've never heard that word before. How do I even pronounce it? So however you want to do, the idea is to make a note of words that are new for you, or again, that maybe you just want to unpack a little bit with the group. And personally, I find that those words that people think they know, but they're like, I've got a little glimmer that maybe there's something more to this word that I'm aware of. Those are where the rich discussions happen. So don't be shy. Don't worry you're going to look like you don't know enough if you say, oh, I know this word, but I'm not 100% sure. Those words where you have a little bit of a question mark are often the ones where there's the most interesting discussion to be had. So again, what we encourage you to do is, if you're using the core vocabulary, for most people, 5 or 10 minutes is plenty of time, but go through, make a note of words that are new to you entirely, and words that are new to you, or maybe you think you're not 100% sure of them. So go through the whole vocabulary and make those notes. And then, if you want, dig into the definitions and see if when you read the definition, you're like, oh, okay, perfect. I completely get it now. This word is 100% clear for me, or whether you still have some questions about that. And what you're going to do is make sure you take good notes on this, because this is something we're going to bring to the group. And when you do part 2, we're going to discuss some of these words that you might still have some outstanding questions about. So again, this is 3 pages long, so I'm going to slowly go through. You can see the first page. This is the second page, so you can always pause the video and just look at this here if you want to use the training. So I'll just pause for a moment so you have a chance to pause that and get a screenshot. And this is page 3, again, of the core vocabulary only, so I'm going to pause here. So again, there is going to be a link to the full PDF training. We encourage you to use that. But you can also just use this, this video and stop and do a little screen grab or something like that. So take 10 or 15 minutes, look through, use the advanced vocabulary if you want. And again, make note of words that are totally new. Make note of words that you have a little bit of a question about. And then in part 2, we'll have an opportunity to discuss those more in depth. Okay. The next part of the training is LGBTQ inclusive language do's and don'ts. And luckily, you may be a little intimidated by LGBTQ inclusive language, but if you work in most fields, you're already really familiar with the concept of inclusive language. So if you especially are a teacher or you're a nurse, you're going to be familiar with a lot of some of the fundamental basics of inclusive language. So one of the most important things is that we're using person first language, meaning I'm not a disabled person, I'm a person with a disability. I'm not a blonde, but I'm a woman with blonde hair, something like that. So the idea is we're making people first and foremost people, and then they have attributes as opposed to reducing people to their attributes. That's something that I'm sure all of you are really familiar with in your own fields to begin with. So I would encourage you to take a minute, if you want to pause the training and think, what sort of training have I already had on inclusive person first language? That's the first best practice. The second best practice, which again, I'm sure all of you are already real familiar with, is that vocabulary is always changing. And there's no shame in that. So we may have all learned words when we were 10 years old that were the respectful term to refer to somebody from a certain country or with a certain physical attribute. And then 20 years later, that word is really shamefully out of date, and we would never say it in a million years. So just be aware that the language changes. It's not your fault. It's nobody's fault, but it is important for us to keep our ears and eyes open and to be aware that language does change, and that something that was explicitly taught to us as the right thing to say may have changed. And then finally, I think the third best practice is to just follow the lead of the folks you're talking about. So if I am introducing my friend to a group and I say, this is my friend Shayna, and she says, oh, actually, it's pronounced Shauna. Of course, I would never say, no, it's Shayna. I'm like, she's the expert. This is a word to refer to her. If she's Shauna, then she's Shauna. So this is a great reason to have a community of friends and family and colleagues who are members of the LGBTQ community, because then you're going to have an opportunity to hear people use language or hear people say, you know what, actually, I'd prefer this word. And then that gives you an insight into what that group of people, that particular person, wants to hear. So I think just having an awareness that people, may make preferences about the words they want to have used around them, being open to that and being respectful to those choices. So I'm going to go through a few of these. I'm not going to go through all of them. But I think just go through a few to illustrate kind of some of these concepts we talked about with best practices, and you'll go through the whole handout when you do that with the full training. So the first line, which is to avoid saying hermaphrodite and instead say intersex, this is a good example of a word that used to be considered a best practice word and is now changed. So something that historically hermaphrodite was a perfectly fine thing to say, and now we really want to say intersex. And mostly the reason for this change is that this word has a negative medical history. It's often, was used by doctors in a way that was not very respectful. And I think it also has a false connotation often that somebody is fully male and fully female. When we hear hermaphrodite, we think of somebody who has a fully developed penis and a fully developed vagina. And usually with intersex folks, it's a little more, they're somewhere on the spectrum. The same goes for homosexual and gay. So back in the 70s, it might have been perfectly appropriate to say homosexual, but times have changed, and gay is the preferred term. I'm going to skip ahead to don't say a gay or a transgender, and instead say a gay or transgender person. And this is a great example of person first language. So instead of reducing somebody to their sexuality or their gender, to make that just one attribute about them. They're a person who is gay, a person who's transgender, but they're not a gay, they're not a transgender. So when you look back at your core vocabulary, you may notice some parts of speech popping out at you, some adjectives where maybe you might have thought it was a noun. So this would be a good point to keep in mind if you go back to that core vocabulary and you want to make any notes about questions. The next one is to avoid saying transgender people and normal people, and instead say transgender people and cisgender people. For most folks, cisgender, which is a word on the core vocabulary sheet, is one of the top 3 new words. So it's, if you've never heard the word cisgender, no shame in that. It's a wonderful word to learn. If you come out of this training with nothing more than what does cisgender mean, you've gotten something really valuable out of this training. And I'm not going to dig into the difference between transgender and cisgender here, but I am going to point out that the point I want to make is transgender and normal. So in all of your various fields, it's very important to not say people with disabilities and normal people, people with cancer and normal people. We don't want to stigmatize. We don't want to make one identity better than another. So this is just a great example of making sure that when we talk about the LGBTQ community, we are not saying normal people and LGBTQ people, right? We've all got rich identities. Nothing is better or worse than another. And we want to make sure that our language and our mindset reflects that. We want to avoid saying both genders or opposite sexes, and we want to say all genders. Now, this may really be a new one for a lot of folks, and the whole idea of gender as a spectrum, or gender as something that is fluid, is pretty recent. And I think if you go back even to some older versions of the Safe Zone training, maybe version 1 or 2, they might not have had this bit of inclusive language, and they might have said both genders or opposite genders. So this is just a great example of the way in which LGBTQ related vocabulary and terminology and the whole way we think is always changing. So again, this is something that you'll get into in your group when you do part 2, but just this idea of thinking more in terms of spectrum, more in terms of fluid, and less in terms of boxes when we're talking about all of these different terms. The next 2 items, not saying ladies and gentlemen, but saying something like folks or honored guests, not saying mailman or fireman, but saying something like mail clerk or postal worker and firefighter. These are great ones to reflect on because they're a great example. And if you have people of different ages in your group, in your reflection in part 2, it's always fascinating to see what words are very comfortable for folks from a certain generation and what still feel a little weird. So I certainly know that growing up in the 1980s and early 90s, it felt very strange to say postal worker or firefighter or police officer. I remember felt like a little awkward. But now to say police officer is very natural. And I'm sure that my nieces and nephews who are millennials, the word police officer doesn't feel like a politically charged gender neutral term. It's just the word that they use. So in your groups, especially if you have folks who are from different regions of different ages, it's always great to sort of see what changes in language are awkward for some groups, what changes in language feel totally natural, and then to also apply this for going forward. So the next time you get faced with a bit of terminology that someone has gone out of their way to make gender neutral or inclusive and it feels a little funny, to think back and think, okay, but what words maybe are very comfortable for me, but somebody of my parent or my grandparents' generation, that's still an awkward word for them. So just being aware of that. And then finally, the last one, to not say it when referring to somebody, but instead say they. And I think just in general, this gets down to, obviously there's a grammatical level of it is for objects, they is for beings, but to just model respect. And it, of course, we all have situations where we really intend to be respectful, but it just, our words are not up to the task, and that's okay. But if we come from with this from a place of respect and from a place of really wanting to get things right, that's the most important thing. So be aware, be mindful, and do your very, very best to be respectful. Okay, so the next activity is the genderbread person. This is a really fascinating activity. A lot of people get a lot out of it. And it's also going to involve the heaviest lecture portion. This is definitely the most lecture heavy part of the presentation. So I'm going to pause part 1 here. I'm going to encourage you to take a break if you haven't already. Get a snack, stretch your legs, and when we come back and do part 2, we will open with the genderbread person and we'll finish up the rest of the training. So I'll see you for part 2.